So the theme of tonight is domestic terrorism, but domestic terrorism and international are totally intertwined. So my first question for Tom is how do you sort out the domestic side? What happened at Fort Hood? What happened in the Christmas Day almost disaster coming in on the plane from Amsterdam? How does that tie in with Al-Qaeda's activities around the world? Where do we stand since 9/11?
Well, I think, first of all, I want to just echo the praise and congratulations, Larry, to you and your team. This is a remarkable notion that we can have a public discourse or something about which we should be committed to dealing with, but not in a breathless way, but in a resolute, thoughtful way, and to make a difference in our communities and our country. So I'm grateful for the opportunity to spend some time with you and your many friends and men and women and families in this community, and my friend Craig Stapleton. If you take a look at the last two incidents that I've most publicized, the Detroit incident on Christmas Day and the Major Hassan, it's, at least in my mind, it calls attention to the fact that the challenge is far more complicated than we thought it would be after we got over the horror and the terror of 9/11. Remember how we profiled the terrorists, or what we thought the would-be terrorists? We thought they were males, 18 to 35, Arabian Peninsula. Fast forward 9 years, and what have we discovered? Males and females, ages vary. Al-Qaeda has control or directed some of the international activity, but in fact, in many instances, it also reflects a change in the nature of Al-Qaeda. It used to be a fairly strong organization. Bin Laden was the head. A lot of the leadership has been destroyed, diffused. To a certain extent, Bin Laden, while still head of Al-Qaeda as an organization, as an entity, I don't think it's quite as strong, as robust, but in fact, he's become the inspirational head and the inspiration to many spin-off either individuals or organizations around the world. These two examples, I think, point out to a couple of challenges we still have in this country. One, we never thought there'd be a domestic terrorist incident, of the like tied with Al-Qaeda. Obviously, we had Timothy McVeigh, we've had other terrorist incidents in this country, but I'm speaking specifically to the jihadist movement, the extremist movement. What I thought, Craig, it basically highlighted for me one of the fundamental problems we ran into when we tried to set up the Department of Homeland Security, and that's the whole notion of information sharing. Who gets access to what information, and then who has the courage, the foresight, the vision, and the energy to take action on it? Major Hassan incident, I think, could have been prevented. Domestic terrorism incident, clearly. His connection, we think, was to a cleric who actually had been an imam in Denver from 94 to 96. Then he went to San Diego. And by the way, there were certain criminal activities around him when he was in San Diego. I won't give you the litany of things that brought him to the FBI's attention way back when. And then there were 18 emails that we knew he was sending to a radical cleric in Yemen who had been hitting a mosque in Washington, D.C. And I remember talking about him with President Bush and others in the Oval Office in the morning because he was a radical imam. He left the United States and went to the United Kingdom. So I have all this background information about a radical cleric whose video cassettes, whose preaching in mosque, etc. We had an email trace from an active duty soldier to this radical cleric in Yemen. And frankly, in my judgment, anybody in the State Department, anybody in the FBI, and anybody related to that knew they had a problem, a serious problem. We talk about connecting dots. Well, sometimes the dots don't need to be connected because they're large dots and they blink red. I'm serious. And so at a certain point you say to yourself, have we lost that sense of urgency? Are we not playing the game on the tip of our toes? Are we not sitting on the edge of our seats? Not to be breathless about it, but some things just jump out at you. And you got to take action. And nobody took action. If you went back and took a look at that history, we could have taken action on that. And I think it's not a timidity. I don't know whether it's being politically correct or whether we just decided, we'll let somebody else make the decision. The same holds true and probably more horrifying example is we have lamented for years the absence of human intelligence in al-Qaeda organization or in terrorist organizations generally. Here we have a father who steps forward, says, I believe my son's radicalized. And oh, by the way, he's in Yemen. And by the way, everybody knows that al-Qaeda in Yemen, and there was an announcement, they had a press release. In 2009, al-Qaeda in Yemen is tied up with al-Qaeda. It's now called al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. And we also know that this radical cleric, the same one that they've been watching since '94, is over there generating support, not only inspirational support, but probably logistic support, and we did nothing. Again, a dot. You don't need to connect that dot. The father says, my son's being radicalized. He's in Yemen. We know what's going on in Yemen. Why they didn't yank his visa and why they didn't put him on the no-fly list, I think I know what happened. We now put in place a process. Somebody hit the send button and said, somebody else make the decision. And so if we're going to be dealing with domestic terrorism, I think we're going to have to accept the notion that every once in a while, somebody may have to make an instantaneous decision to act, move quickly. And they may be wrong, but we're just going to have to take that chance. My view was if you yank the visa and put him on the no-fly list and he's got a complaint, you can tell him to go talk to his father. The bottom line is you can't lose sight of the fact that some information is so credible that you got to act on it immediately and not hit the send button and let somebody else make a decision.
To me, that's a discouraging commentary because there were dots that could be connected, and we actually, as in retrospect, knew what to do.
If you saw the list, Craig, if you saw the list of things that we knew that Awaliki was responsible for from '94 on, you'd be astonished. We didn't pick him up and arrest him. I mean, folks, they had him in California one time for soliciting prostitution. Wanted to bring him a Mann Act. They had him connected with a charity that later on we thought was skimming money and sending it to terrorist organizations. We had them talking to one of the blind sheikh's closest colleagues. We know he's preaching radical sermons in the mosque in Great Britain. And all these are out there, and then we got an active duty soldier emailing him 18 times, and nobody did anything. I don't know what happened. I mean, Senator Lieberman and Senator Collins very rightly have said, okay, we tried to get information from the administration. We got to find out what happened to make sure it never happens again.
So 9 plus 10 years on, we've been trying to connect the dots. I was in Prague as ambassador when Mohammed Atta was identified after 9/11 as one of the main attackers, maybe the organizer of the attack on the World Trade Center. And we knew that he had been in Prague, that he'd been canvassing Radio Free Europe, that they had pictures of him. We knew he was part of it. Everybody's picking up the story of Mohammed Atta after the fact. What is your perception of the international cooperation we were getting when you first came into your job and the international cooperation that we have now?
Well, I think, Craig, you're probably as good or better position than I am to judge that, but you and I have talked about this before. I think in spite of the fact that the politics around the re-election in some of our traditional allies in Germany and France, they managed to try to use a certain antipathy towards the United States in order to further their own political careers. Even though that was going on at the top level, I think the law enforcement and the intelligence community was tied up pretty tight. So they did politics, they did what they had to do politically, whether we liked it or not, they did it. But my sense from talking to Bob Mueller, the FBI director, from talking to Attorney General Ashcroft and others, is that frankly, there's a recognition in the broader global community that it is a global scourge. It could happen to anyone, anytime, any place, and that we better be together in terms of information sharing. And so I think that's a fairly stable platform. And I'll be frankly, I know you're the moderator, but Craig, what did you see when you were in Prague and in Paris about that?
Well, it was very interesting. We had a very left-wing socialist prime minister in the Czech Republic, Zeman, and he regularly said, I'm a warrior against terrorism from day one. Yep. And as you know, the Czechs sent in after the invasion of Iraq, they sent their top NBC unit, which is Nuclear Biological Chemical Unit,
Yep.
which was the best unit within NATO, and they dispatched that to Iraq, fully anticipating with the rest of the Western community that those attacks were going to take place. So the Czechs, with their history with the Russians and their history with the West, they believed it was real. And incidentally, during the time I was there was also an anthrax threat right after the anthrax threat broke out in the United States, and we closed our embassy, and we had guys walking around with, spraying everything in town. We had to close the embassy down for days. In France, it was interesting. When I went there, President Chirac had been the main opponent of the United States invasion of Iraq, the international opponent, but the security people and the military people couldn't cooperate more, partially, I think, to compensate for their non-participation in Iraq. And when I went to France, the Interior Minister was Nicolas Sarkozy, and they absolutely believed, because they had their map out, and they saw what had happened in Madrid, and they saw in July of 2005 just when I got there in London, and they knew what had happened in Yemen, and they knew what had happened in Iraq and Bali and these other places around the world, and in Somalia, and they believed absolutely within a shadow of doubt that they would be attacked in Paris. And so the intelligence cooperation and the surveillance cooperation, I think, was from all our experts was just about complete.
Yeah, I think by and large the world community, I mean, we're not terribly well educated about Islam, but almost 23% of the world's population practices a religion. We're talking about 1.2, 1.3 billion people. And again, most Americans think that the epicenter of this world is the Arabian Peninsula, but in fact, it's in Africa, it's in Asia, it's Malaysia and Indonesia, India, China. I mean, so the broader global community does have an interest. They may deal with it differently, but we do have an interest to sharing information in order to try to deal with the scourge that is terrorism. I mean, one of the big challenges I think we have long term is to understand that we're at war. We're not necessarily at war against a tactic, we're at war against a belief system. And to the extent that our discussion takes us down that path, the broader world community has a collective interest in trying to undermine that belief system, because it could happen to any country. And unfortunately it's true, anybody, anywhere, anytime. And most world leaders understand that.
For those of us in Europe right after 9/11, we understood what a few people could do when they hijacked planes, but the big threat was when they went to more devastating weapons. If they had the same suicide mentality to take out 2 buildings, we were thinking about taking out hundreds of thousands of people in Wall Street if you'd had NBC weapons, and that has a lot to do with the tough posture the Bush administration has taken, the Obama administration took toward Iran, North Korea, Syria, Pakistan. Those were all issues. Where do you think if you see Larry's program in the cell, you see the video, you see one-shot terrorism. But where do we stand in terms of dealing with NBC types of terrorism? Do we even have a sense of where we are?
Well, I think Americans are probably a little bit more sensitive, hopefully we are, that you've got a non-state-centered terrorist group like Al-Qaeda, and then you have a terrorist regime in Iran that is really responsible for supporting, in a very organizational way, with financial aid and other aid, several other terrorist organizations. So you have this kind of, not amorphous, but this non-state-centered organization from Sunni. You have a Shiite organization around Iran with Hamas, Hezbollah, the Palestinian Islamic Jihad. They're supporting some of the insurgents in Iraq. And so I think what Americans, hopefully since 9/11, have become aware of is that our interests are challenged, not just because of the spin-off organizations and those who might be loyal to bin Laden, that perverted, distorted interpretation of the Quran, but you also have state-centered terrorism that is creating great havoc, causing great problem, and trying to undermine Western and American interest around the rest of the world. So I'd like to think in a post-9/11 world, while people are still worried about their job and worried about getting the kids to school and worried about, taking care of all those things that moms and dads worry about in the community and people worry about, have a little bit, their ear a little bit more tuned in to the real threat of terrorism, either domestic or international, because at the end of the day, they're kind of tied together. And whether it's the state-centered terrorism or Al-Qaeda, they look to undermine America's interest and Western interest around the world.
We've started to talk about the threat of cybersecurity in terms of what it could do to the infrastructure and the grids in the U.S.
Yep.
And obviously with our incredibly linked society now. What do you think the risks are there, and what does the Department of Homeland Security do when you were there, and what are they doing now to get ready for these risks that aren't well defined?
Yeah. One of the interesting challenges we had when we set up the department, and it was about 180,000 people, 20,000 plus agencies of government. And so, as I try to explain to some of my friends in a business mindset, we had mergers, acquisitions, divestitures, and startups all going on at the same time. And we had HR, and we had budgeting, and we had fiscal, and we had procurement all going on. We had multiple programs. At the same time, we were responsible to start not only building the department, also start thinking about security platforms. And cyber was something we took very seriously amidst everything else we were trying to do with the borders, in international collaboration and the like. And so we started working with the academic community, started with Carnegie Mellon and then the private sector to almost a readiness campaign. As soon as we were became aware of malware, a virus or something of that sort, tried to identify the source, get the private sector involved. And that has, I think, under Secretary Chertoff, and I suspect that now with more resources under Secretary Napolitano, that has become a bigger platform within Homeland Security. But the National Security Agency has a piece of that, the Department of Defense has a piece of that, and so a lot of people are talking about cybersecurity. I think the challenge we have within that group is to define what we mean. And where do we go with all these resources that are committed to dealing with the issues of people attacking our financial service system, our electric grid, undermining our bank payment system and the like. And some of the bigger global issues are there are no standards for cybersecurity around the world. And if we found that a country was responsible for a massive disruption of anything in our country or a NATO country or in an allied country, would we be prepared? If we could attribute it to a country, how would we respond? I mean, we did have that notion of mutual assured destruction when the NATO allies and everybody, we pledged to come to each other's support, but are we prepared to do it internationally if somehow there is a serious disruption, a cyber disruption of some elemental services we have in the United States? So we have a long way to go. I think one of the challenges that President Obama has, his cyber czar is a man who used to be on my advisory board of my company, Howard Schmidt, great guy. But you have Howard there, and then you have a chief information officer in the White House, then you have a chief technology officer in the White House. And then you've got similar offices throughout the government. So at the end of the day, you say to yourself, all right, who's got the comprehensive plan? Who's going to set the priorities? And who's going to delegate roles and responsibilities in order to get things done? Under this president, give credit where credit's due, I think we finally elevated the issue to a point where people are starting to talk about it, but now people have to be assigned specific tasks. And you can't do it without the total engagement of the private sector. The private sector has to be part and parcel of it all.
And how about the relations with state and local government in terms of information sharing and implementation? How do you in our federal system, much different than you have in France, for instance, which everything is, all the police units are controlled centrally. There's a flow of information that comes to one point.
You know, I stole I didn't steal, but when I was working in the White House, we worked with a lot of Homeland Security advisors. Is Sue Menser here? Sue was your Colorado's Homeland Security advisor, and she featured prominently in the video, as she should be. But we had a Office of Coordination and Office of State and Local Government that worked on coordination and preparation. And one of the mindsets that I thought was helpful for a governor to be the first secretary was that Homeland Security could be a federal agency, but it's a national mission. And we have to accept the fact that our mayors and our governors are partners, just as well as local law enforcement have to be viewed as partners. They're not adjuncts, they're not on the periphery. And so the continued debate is, I mean, we're glad we started that urban security initiative. Money fairly well spent, much better spent today now that we got some rules and regulations around it, much tighter. But it's always a challenge of how much information gets down to people. And we fought my friends from time to time in the FBI who kind of wanted to hold it close. And we'd say, well, you may have to tell that big city mayor, you may have to tell that police chief, you may have to tell the gov. It may not be actionable, but you ought to tell them that. But I think there have been tremendous strides taken with regard to information sharing. I'm still not convinced that it's there exactly where it should be, but you got a great special agent here, and he gets nothing but rave from the people in the local community. So I just thought that should be recognized as well. But President Bush said it correctly. Information is what you act on. You make a business decision. How do you make a business decision? You got to have information. You have to aggregate enough information, intel, that tells you have to act. And that goes back to the first question. There you didn't need an aggregate. It was right in front of your face. Act on it. Sometimes you have to act, and if it didn't work out, you ask for forgiveness later. But better err on the side of security than not.
And that's usually not what government officials are used to doing.
Well, they're risk averse.
They're risk averse.
And Homeland Security is about risk management. I mean, it's a serious problem. We'll deal with it. Let's not be breathless about it. It's serious. It's not going to go away, but let's manage the risk and not try to eliminate it because it's impossible in a democracy to do, and we don't even want to try.
You said earlier that the private sector, the business community, plays a critical role in
Absolutely.
that. What kind of things are they doing? What kind of things can they do?
Well, the first thing, first of all, I think the private sector has invested without any government incentives or government money far more in a post-9/11 world in securing critical infrastructure than they're given credit for. I don't think there's anybody's ever aggregated the number, but I think that the nuclear industry, those utility companies have done more, the financial service industry have done more. You go across the energy, everybody's done more. But I think at the end of the day, the real challenge is to make sure that their security professionals have access to information they may need to ramp up security when it's required. I think we have to pull them in and encourage them. We're never going to have more people to help us with security, but the technology of protection and the technology of detection is still somewhat languishing behind. It's only the private sector, the entrepreneur, or the small company, the big company is going to deal with that. And then we come around to dealing with cybersecurity, which I think next to potential biological attack is probably the most serious problems we confront in this country. We definitely need the input. We have to get by antitrust rules and regulations, but we need the collective input and experience of the private sector to help us with cybersecurity issues. Got a lot of talented people in the federal government. You just don't have enough. You don't have that breadth and depth of experience to make it happen.
When we get information sources, what's your view, and when we intercept potential terrorists, what's your view of how they needed to be treated in terms of law and the venue for trials versus military tribunals? How does that get sorted out?
Well, I appreciate the Attorney General's point of view with regard to. I just don't share it. I mean, everybody's entitled to an opinion. It's called First Amendment. I mean, we actually had some people out there. I don't know if you saw them. Somebody out there had a color-coded system. Anyhow, everybody's got a reason to complain. He probably didn't like the colors. We were going to use fuchsia, which means you're under attack by Marcia Stewart. Anyhow. So this whole notion of information sharing, I think, goes to the heart of what we need to do as a country, and we still have more work to do there.
And how do you read the American people in terms of their preparedness in terms of terrorism? Did they think 9/11 was an isolated incident that won't happen again? What do you, as a political guy who has a good feel for our citizens, where do you think we are?
I think for the past couple of years, given the economic conditions, the political environment, I mean, there's a lot of very critical national and international issues that I think have pushed this whole notion of counterterrorism and homeland security down the list of America's priorities. I regret that. I think, to a certain extent, the incidents in December and at Fort Hood kind of reflect that notion that we're not quite as attentive. We don't quite have that sense of urgency. I mean, one of the reasons I wrote a book on this was to try to remind Americans that we've dealt with incredible challenges before in our nation's history. We've always dealt with them. We need to deal with them in a way that's consistent with the American value system, but we have always dealt with them. To the point you just made, and I didn't answer the question completely about how the Attorney General is dealing with it. I don't think they ought to be tried in criminal court because I don't think they're criminals. I think they're terrorists. And I was a prosecutor for a while. And you let me slide, but I really want to throw this out there. I never prosecuted. One of the things you do when you run for office is, I was a defense attorney one time too, but people don't give defense attorneys warm embraces, so I made sure everybody knew I was a prosecutor. But I've been on both sides of the table. But the criminals, regardless of the they're not normally interested in getting caught, and they're certainly not interested in blowing themselves up in order to advance their cause. So this whole the notion that there's a mindset. The second, I think, aberration in our thinking is that that the only way they can get due process is through our criminal justice system. That's wrong. Criminal justice is a means of due process, but civil court is a means of due process. Bankruptcy court's a means of due process. The Code of Military Justice is a system of due process. I, for one, am in favor of a separate court system just to deal. Due process means a right to be heard, independent tribunal, transparency in terms of evidence, and a right of appeal. We can build, and I think if you believe as I do, we're going to be at this for a while. I just think we ought to come up with a separate court system, small, experienced, will provide those qualities which is consistent with the American brand, but not KSM in the middle of New York City. KSM elsewhere, but not in criminal court. He's a terrorist.